People often describe dementia as the long goodbye, but what they don't prepare you for, and what so many spouses tell me, is that it feels like you're losing your loved one twice. And the first loss happens when your loved one is still here and physically present after the diagnosis. And the second loss is when their physical life ends. And it's heartbreaking because no one really talks about the grief that comes before the funeral. The grief of having your spouse right beside you, but realizing the person you built your life with is slowly slipping away. I remember a night I was working in the ER and a husband brought his wife in, and she was combative and she was really yelling and screaming and more off than she normally was. And I can remember him looking terrified and him whispering to me, "This isn't who she was. She would never have refused help before." And he was grieving right then and there. And there was nothing at that moment that I could say that was enough to comfort him. But that's the reality of dementia in marriage. The grief doesn't wait until the end, it begins much sooner than anticipated. The first farewell that you might experience with your loved one often starts quietly. It's subtle. It's those little tiny changes, like they're forgetting things or they're struggling to follow with conversations. And at first, you're explaining it off in your mind like, well, maybe they're just stressed out, or maybe it's their age. But then it comes to that realization that something is fundamentally changing in your person. I was recently talking with a caregiver in my one-on-one sessions, and she looked down and she was shaking her head as she was stirring her coffee. And she said, "Laura, I feel like a widow already." And yet her husband was sitting in the next room. And I thought to myself, how unfair for her that this is how heavy the grief can feel. And what makes this so painful is not just the memory slips, it's the erosion of those rituals, of those routines that the two of you do together that made your marriage what it is today. Maybe it was that morning coffee together, or sharing the news, or reading your favorite book together. Or it could be watching your favorite TV show and eating popcorn on the couch every single Thursday. But no matter what it is, those routines can be greatly missed. And I'll never forget a husband who told me, "The hardest part isn't that she forgets names or doesn't remember our children. It's that she doesn't laugh at the same jokes anymore, and our rhythm is gone." He missed the banter back and forth, their inside couple jokes, and those little exchanges that used to make them feel like such a team. And this is that first farewell, losing the person in those pieces while still waking up next to them. And this naturally leads into the second phase. This is what I call the paradox of presence. Your spouse is physically there and they're sitting in the chair right across from you. Their clothes are still hanging in the closet, but emotionally, you feel profoundly alone. And this is so understandable. A wife told me that very shortly after losing her husband, she still found herself cooking 2 plates every evening, only to then scrape the one into the garbage. Her mind was still in that caregiving mode, and she was grieving the loss of her husband, and she was in her own patterns at this point. Another spouse told me that he would turn on their favorite TV show and then he would switch it right back off again because he realized that he was actually watching the show alone, that she was no longer participating. And here's the hardest part for caregivers. Friends and family, they don't understand the situation. They see your spouse there, he's alive or she's alive, and they assume that you're not grieving. And here's the hardest part about this. Your friends and your family aren't going to see the silent grieving because your person is still right there, and they don't know that you're grieving the loss of your loved one. And so they think that you're actually doing okay, shattering into a million little pieces. What they don't see is that you're grieving because every day you're missing those routines that the two of you once shared, those things that connected you. And now you're constantly reminded of that absence until the day that your invisible grief meets your visible grief. If you're caring for your spouse with dementia, Eventually comes the second farewell, the physical goodbye. And when your spouse passes, the world around you finally understands and recognizes your grief. There's the funeral, there's sympathy cards, there's flowers, there's casseroles at your door. But here's what I see not only in spouses, but a lot of caregivers. By the time that the funeral actually comes, they've already been grieving for years. And that can tend to make the grief much more complicated. And let me explain what I mean. I was with a caregiver after her husband passed, and we were sitting in the funeral home, and she was crying. And I went and put my arm around her, and I said, "I am so sorry." And she said, "I really miss him, but I can finally breathe for the first time in years." And she then went on to say, "That makes me feel so horrible. I feel like a bad person." And that's the paradox of grieving twice. It's that grief that's tangled with relief and then the guilt for feeling the relief. And while you're grieving the person you love, there's another kind of loss that almost no one will talk about. Dementia doesn't just take your spouse, it reshapes the person that you've become. And one day you're a wife or a husband, and then the next day you're a nurse, you're an advocate, a manager of medications and appointments. And slowly you realize your role as a spouse is being overtaken by the role of a caregiver. I saw a comment in our group recently that said, "For 50 years, I was her partner, and then I was her caregiver, and now I don't know who I am." And that's the loss that nobody talks about, the one that no one prepares you for, the loss of yourself. While you're grieving the changes in your spouse, you're also grieving the parts of your own identity that feel like they're slowly slipping away. And sometimes, when caregiving ends, it can leave many spouses and many caregivers asking the question, "Who am I now?" And that's understandable because you've spent so many years in the caregiving role. And this is the unspoken layer of grief in marriage and dementia. And it's every bit as real as the others. And if you're sitting there and feel like I've turned a wrench right inside of your heart, you're definitely not alone in this. And you're probably thinking to yourself, "Okay, great. You've just described a situation that I've been experiencing for years. So, how do I survive this kind of double loss, or really this layered loss?" What I've seen help families in the past is by helping them create small little rituals or remembrances. And these don't have to be like these grand gestures, just things that keep meaning alive. One of the caregivers I'm working with said, "You're right. I still need to go take my walks. He's okay for that short 20 minutes, so I'm going to walk the neighborhood route, even though he can no longer walk it with me." Another person I was working with said she played her husband's favorite songs while cooking dinner, not because she expected him to sing along, but because it kept him present in her heart. Inside of my membership, I use something called the My Story template. And the way that I normally like to use this is if your loved one is going into an assisted living or you'd like to have a caregiver come into your home, this provides their whole story and it allows that person to take over in your absence. And this way they get to know your person for who they are and not just a diagnosis. But somebody recently told me that they were using the My Story template as a way to preserve their person's legacy by writing down their person's habits, their favorite foods, their quirks, and their routines. And for her, this became a healing exercise, something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away. And having a community is really important too. Whether it's in person or online, I've seen people breathe so much easier when someone else says, "I feel the exact same way that you do," because validation can be very powerful. And slowly, if you keep doing these things, resilience will start to grow. And no one is telling you to leave it and forget it or set it and forget it or, hey, just get over your grief. I'm asking you to think about healing in a different way. And healing doesn't mean just getting over it. You don't get over losing your spouse once, let alone twice. Healing looks like acceptance and naming that dementia rewrote your marriage story. It looks like advocacy and using your journey to shed light on those unseen grief moments. And it does look like preserving their dignity and honoring their legacy, planting those flowers they loved, or keeping Sunday dinners alive, or telling the grandchildren stories about who their grandparent was before the dementia. And this is how I encourage spouses to make peace with the love that didn't end but transformed. And yes, I do understand that dementia and marriage really does feel like you're losing your spouse twice. The first time with the erosion of the routines and the patterns that you had, and all those memories that you shared in the past or the future ones that you didn't get to make. And woven through is the hidden loss of yourself that comes when roles shift from spouse to caregiver. It's the grief that's hidden, misunderstood, and often invisible. But it's also the grief that proves just how deep love can truly run. And if you're living this right now, I want you to hear this. When people don't understand you for grieving the loss of your loved one right now while they're still alive, it doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. We need to start normalizing this grieving process and recognizing it more. This is where I truly believe another gap in the system exists. We're not helping people get through that loss and then the loss in ways that are effective for them to cope with their situation. And for those of you who've had a loved one pass, you're not wrong for feeling relief later, and you're not alone in any of that. We need to start recognizing that this is a normal feeling for caregivers. And for those of you who still need permission, you have my permission to feel relief, to feel that weight taken off your chest. It's okay to feel those things when your loved one passes. It doesn't mean that you've loved them any less. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love for you to drop a comment and tell me what's the hardest part of marriage and dementia for you right now, because sharing your story helps others feel less alone and less isolated. I've created tools inside my membership that help close those gaps and help you, the caregiver, not lose yourself while providing the best care possible. Because no spouse, no caregiver should have to carry this multi-layered loss without any support. I look forward to reading your comments, and until next week, I'll be here caring for you while you're caring for them. And until next week,